Donald Trump came into office promising to be the America First president, as well as a peaceful president. But what challenges do he and Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State, face in shaping the nation's foreign policy over the next 4 years? And what opportunities, of which there are many, both in the Middle East and beyond, do they have before them? In late January, Elliott Abrams joined me on the podcast to discuss the future of U.S. foreign policy. Elliott is a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and has decades of foreign policy experience under multiple U.S. presidents. He served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor supervising Middle East policy under George W. Bush and as Special Representative for Iran and Venezuela in the first Trump administration, among other appointments. Our conversation covered the Middle East, from Gaza to Iran, and also the war in Ukraine, and how Trump and Rubio intend to approach our commitments to allies and alliances such as NATO. Thanks for tuning in. I'm David Satterfield, Director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. Elliott, we face now a new administration, an administration confronting not just challenges, which have been laid out very well, but also opportunities in the Middle East as well as around the world. And in the case of the Middle East, which I want to come back to with you, given our common background in that area stretching over many years, the opportunities in many ways are potentially greater than they've been in 40-plus years. But I want to start with a quote from the new Secretary of State, Rubio. What he said in a public set of remarks and in a press release is, President Trump has given me a clear direction to place our core national interest as the guiding mission of American foreign policy. Every dollar we spend, every program we fund, and every policy we pursue must be justified with the answer to three simple questions. Does it make America safer? Does it make America stronger? Does it make America more prosperous? Well, now, in our common experience, I don't think there is any U.S. President or Secretary of State that would disagree that policies should be justified in those terms. But let's take it from a rhetorical frame to the real world. And let's start with a challenge. Ukraine, Vladimir Putin, and his Russia. Elliott, what are the opportunities here? And what are the consequences if those opportunities are not seized?
Well, I agree with your framing that there are some great opportunities here, particularly in the Middle East, and we can come back to that. I think the problem with Rubio's language, it doesn't really answer the question, okay, what do we do about Ukraine? Those who say what we do is we give them 100% backing that Biden didn't, and those who say it's a losing game, let's just get away from it, both will claim that they're making America safer and freer and more prosperous. And the same thing is true about almost any problem you can name, the Iranian nuclear program, China and Taiwan. So it's a good framing, but it doesn't answer the questions. In Europe, I would say, Trump actually began the process in an odd way of strengthening NATO. Last time around, there was an acceptance, if not full performance, that the Europeans need to do more to defend themselves. For us to be, and for them to be, safer and freer, they do need to do more. And one of the things that I think Rubio will push, because Trump wants it to be pushed, NATO's got to follow through. The NATO countries have got to build military institutions that are credible, not because we are doing nothing, but because they're prosperous countries and it's their freedom at stake. They need to do more. Can he negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine? He very much wants to do that. And he made some remarks on his third day in office about how he would punish Putin if Putin is unwilling to do a reasonable deal. The problem or the challenge for the United States, we're in the middle, and we're going to want a compromise probably. The Trump administration is that will require both Ukraine and Russia to do things they don't want to do. And the threat, of course, the implicit threat, now explicit in the case of Russia, is if Putin says, no, I want to keep every square foot, I want Ukraine not only not in NATO, I don't want them in the EU, and he makes maximalist demands, I think Trump is going to push him very hard. And Trump has said he's not in good shape. His economy is in very bad shape. same for Ukraine. That is, a maximalist position that requires that Russia get out of every square foot it has taken, including Crimea, is going to lose Trump. So he does have a lot of leverage. And his basic argument, the dying has to stop, the killing has to stop, is an attractive argument, I think, for a lot of Americans and maybe a lot of Ukrainians.
I think it is an attractive argument, and it's not too far away from some of the fundamental private conclusions drawn by the previous administration. But pressures on Russia sound good. Are they a weak state? Yes, they are. Are they in many ways a dying demographic, a dying society? Yes. But they are, to be very reductionist, an oil well with nuclear weapons. They have the ability to withstand extraordinary sanctions. Their exports to the United States are minimal now, and they are things that we could supplant if we needed to. Getting at Russian oil exports, the illicit exports, very, very difficult challenge. Hard with Iran, but more doable than with Russia. So the constraining factors we can bring to bear, they're significant. With Ukraine, obviously, our influence is far, far greater. But the real question here is, at the end of the deal, if you can get a deal, what's the guarantee that it only buys a year or two or three till Putin can rebuild the Russian armed forces and achieve his ultimate goal?
You know, what was the guarantee during the Cold War? It was not really Article 5 of NATO. It was American troops. If the Russians came through the Fulda Gap, they were going to have to kill Americans. The theory was that's why they won't. And it worked. I would say a version of the same thing here. That is, I think if you want to guarantee a Ukrainian border, you may want to have European troops there. I don't think Trump's going to agree to put American troops there, but if you had British, French, German troops in those places, I think that would be a meaningful statement to Russia. Coming across the border now is simply out of the question. I would say for us, I would hope that we would continue what's been going on for about 10 years, and that is moving some of our troops eastward. It is much more sensible for them to be in Poland than in Germany, to be in the Baltics. And we are, of course, rotating troops through. I hope we continue that because it is a guarantee of their safety. And it is, I hope, part of our pressure for them to continue to spend more on defense.
Elliott, I couldn't agree with you more, but such a step would run up against two almost certain issues. First, Putin would see it as a further threatening gesture. We were closer into, if not on, the near abroad. And secondly, those within the administration who are arguing strenuously for a China-based policy will see it as yet another, if not riskier, engagement of U.S. forces in Europe to the derogation of the ability to confront the Chinese threat in Asia-Pacific. How do you answer that?
We don't know yet whether those people will control the foreign policy of the Trump second term. We don't really know where Trump is on that. We know where Bridge Colby is on that. And people who follow his analyses. There is another line of thought, as you know, which says basically that these problems are for the United States so deeply linked that it is foolish to think you can abandon allies in one place, you can reduce your reliability as an ally in one place, whether it's the Middle East or Europe, without that having an impact in Asia. That is, if you prove to the Europeans or to the Gulf Arabs that your word is not worth that much, and think that, well, the Australians, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Vietnamese, the Indians are not listening, and the Chinese are not listening, that's a foolish policy. Where will Trump come out on all this? Unclear. And I would argue, of course, and others will disagree, we're not talking about any additional American troops in Europe. We're talking about where they are and putting them in places where I would think they would be more useful.
It would, without question, send a surprising and, I think, chilling message to Vladimir Putin to see President Trump willing to take such a step. It's not NATO. It's not extension of the Article 5 guarantee. But boy, is it a sign that the U.S. is serious, and I think somebody else would pay great attention. To all of this. So I think your point on the broader consequences are right. But before we leave this immediate issue, abandoning alliances, not abandoning alliances, commitments, safer, stronger, more prosperous America. Jim Baker would say those are all fine goals. But in their advancing, in their execution, You need to be very pragmatic, but you need to have principles. And let me ask you, where do principles, values, the idea of America, where does that all stand? Does it stand today?
If you look at Marco Rubio's career, he really has been someone who stood for those values, who talked about those values, who talked about his own family coming from Cuba, escaping communism. Where the president stands on this, I think, is unclear. He's famously transactional. It's not clear to me at all that those principles are going to be central to our foreign policy. Now, Joe Biden and Tony Blinken, when they came to office, said, we are restoring human rights to the center of American foreign policy, and they did not do it. I don't object to the policy as much as I object to the hypocrisy. They didn't do it because no government is an NGO. We have commercial and financial and security and other interests all around the world. So we can never make human rights the center of foreign policy, except in the broadest way that Ronald Reagan did. That I think we can do. And the problem is that President Trump doesn't seem to agree with that. The formula that Rubio laid out is very Trumpy formula, if you will. It does not recognize what Reagan did, which is that our association, the association of the United States with the cause of freedom, is one of our greatest assets. It is true that people are coming here or wish to come here for economic advantage, but they also want to come here because of the nature of this society. We stand for freedom. People around the world know that. And I think we lose a great deal if we lose that association with the cause of freedom. It is a mistake to think that, now you're going to get into 10 more wars. Tell me how many wars Ronald Reagan got into. But I think if we take the position that we're not interested, those are the old times, that's Cold War stuff, that's going to get us into trouble, that's going to get us into war, I think we are losing a gigantic American asset. So I hope that as Rubio interprets and Mike Waltz interprets for the president what this all means, the sense that we as a country, as a society, stand for, wish to protect certain values, political, civil rights and liberties, I hope that doesn't disappear.
But Elliott, there's an unsquarable circle here, and you alluded to it, which is human rights, values. They're critical parts of any foreign policy that's worth the name of policy. But you can't apply them always to the same degree. And I'll give you an example which the previous administration and which this administration confronted and will confront. India. India is vital, strategically vital to the safety, prosperity, and strength of the United States in the face of Chinese efforts, to a lesser extent Russian efforts, to put guardrails on Chinese policy. And so the Biden administration didn't overlook, it was well aware of the gross human rights abuses being conducted by the government of India against its own people. But it saw a broader strategic path here of vital importance for decades ahead to the United States. That, I don't think, is abandonment of human rights. It is the pragmatic, real-world triaging of interests, values, doing what you can when you can, and assessing what the consequences, I think we're both consequentialists, of taking a different policy approach that sounds good, reads well, but would have produced results that don't meet any, not just of Secretary Rubio's, President Trump's goals, but any U.S. strategic foreign policy goals. That's hard to sell. It's hard to talk about, but it's real.
It is real. Look, Franklin Roosevelt had an alliance with Joseph Stalin. Jimmy Carter's first New Year's as president was where? Tehran. Telling the Shah how much his people loved him. So presidents are all, at some level, realists. But you do have to have that goal in mind. Why are you doing this? Why are you making a human rights compromise? And I think most presidents do, and I hope that this administration will too. I certainly agree with you on the critical nature of the U.S.-India relationship. The world's most populous country today, and we want it to be as free and democratic as possible. Our association with it is going to make that more likely. So I think the U.S.-India relationship, which really I have to give credit to George W. Bush for turning around, for solving the nuclear problem in about 2005, this is a critical relationship for us, go through the list again, for our safety, for our prosperity, largely because of China today. But it would be a critical relationship if Xi Jinping fell and China became democratic. Anyway, One could say the same thing about Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. These are not, to say the least, democratic countries, but they're important allies of ours, and we have seen effective, efficient, legitimate government in both Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And I think the word legitimacy here is critically important. What do the people of the country think of their government? Now, I would argue, for example, that in the eyes of Saudis and Emiratis, those are fully legitimate governments, but in the eyes of Iranians, many millions of Iranians, their regime, the Islamic Republic, is not legitimate. They never wanted it and don't today.
And on that note, let's turn to the Middle East. And we'll start with Iran. For the first time in 45 years, there are indications, the consequence of the dramatic revelation of Iran's fundamental weaknesses, the exceptional Israeli operation with strong, vital U.S. backing that took place on October 26, that took away air defenses, ballistic missile production facilities, in a way that sent a powerful strategic message. Didn't kill or injure very many Iranians, but it sent a message that's been absorbed. The Iranian rhetoric now, outliers excluded, is very much, we're in the marketplace. We'd like to deal. Now, the Trump administration has not made clear what a deal could be. What are the parameters? Is it sharp JCPOA triple plus constraints on enrichment, inspections, put in ballistic missile programs, objectionable behaviors? The Houthis loom large in that regard, but they're not alone. Or is it the elimination, I use the word in quote marks, of the nuclear program? Where do they go? They need to decide. What do they want?
Go back to the first Trump term, maximum pressure. People never ask maximum pressure for what? And the answer is he wanted negotiation. He's not really a regime change guy. He thought the JCPOA transactionally was just a bad deal. And he thought, if I bankrupt these guys, if I destroy their economy, I can negotiate a better deal. That was the goal of it. And people say, well, it failed. It was a 2-year policy, not a 4-year policy. We don't know if it would have failed had he had 4 more years. Now he's got them. I think that will be his goal again. That doesn't mean he won't go back to maximum pressure. I expect he will. But the goal will be to negotiate a deal better than the JCPOA. How? First of all, by including the proxies, by including regional matters, such as the Houthis, Shia militias in Iraq, Hezbollah, Hamas, and, of course, the nuclear program. The nuclear program is much larger now in terms of how much enriched uranium do they have and to what percentage are they enriching. That will have to be part of a deal. The danger, I think, is the Iranians and Zarif are now talking about how much they want to negotiate. My fear is that they will, in a sense, wrap the Trump administration in a negotiation that goes on and doesn't get anywhere. I think the question is that indeed what Trump wants? I'm suggesting he does. Or does he think we're too close to them having a nuclear weapon now? And that's got to be resolved more quickly. That is presumably the Netanyahu view. And I think the first meeting, whenever that is, maybe February when Netanyahu comes here, what's going to be his agenda? He's going to want to talk to Trump about the Iranian nuclear program. Gaza, yes. Lebanon, yes. But above all, about the nuclear program, because the situation lends itself more today to an Israeli strike than it has certainly since about 2012 and maybe ever.
Absolutely, Elliott. But let's recall something. An Israeli strike or strikes directed against the nuclear program cannot, as a matter of fact, eliminate the program. Only the United States has the means, the delivery systems, and the weaponry to try to get to that end. Israel can deter, it can disrupt, but it would be incumbent on us directly, U.S. planes, U.S. pilots, U.S. weapons, to try to effect an elimination. And even there, it would be probably more than a single surgical move. That's something the president, any president, would have to reflect on.
He will. And I think the argument being made to Trump would be, on the one hand, this is like Soleimani. This is 1 day. This is 2 days. And then we're done with it. And those who are against it will say, no, this is Iraq. You're going to get caught in a war with Iran. All of this is going to be discussed, if it hasn't been already, with the president when, for one thing, the Gulf Arab leaders come, because I think they're very much afraid of that exchange between Israel and Iran, and when Netanyahu comes. And my guess, and it's a pure guess, just looking at this, is that Trump will want to try the negotiated route first. It's very good for Iran because that means presumably he holds off the Israelis for a while. But I imagine he will tell Netanyahu, if they're not negotiating in good faith, if they don't stop enriching at 60%, if they don't start allowing full IAEA inspections, I'll be with you.
Let's talk about that meeting with Bibi Netanyahu. There is a lot to talk about there. And I take it as a serious statement that President Trump wants a grand deal in the Middle East, to include Iran, but not confined to Iran. He wants to be seen as the guy who settled, at least stabilized fundamentally in a strategic sense, the Middle East. What does that take? It certainly takes a deal with Iran or measures with respect to Iran. It takes a Saudi deal with the United States, normalization with Israel. That's clearly part and parcel of what Donald Trump wants to see. It's what Joe Biden wants to see and worked strenuously for. All the bilateral pieces, U.S., Saudi, are in place for that deal. And they're not aimed at normalization with Israel. They're aimed at other strategic objectives, notably but not exclusively China. Now, if Donald Trump comes to Bibi Netanyahu and says, these are all the things I want to see done, but I also want to see no violence in Lebanon. I want to see no violence in Gaza, because wars there, conflict there, is disruptive to everybody, including my interests. But you have got to be able to do something to get all the pieces of this deal, except for Iran, to come together. And I'm not sure what the formulation is which Donald Trump and his administration will advance, but I suspect, given where Mohammed bin Salman and the rest of the critical Gulf partners are, is something akin to a credible pathway to a negotiated permanent status resolution. That's going to be a tough message, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if it is part of what Donald Trump says you're going to have to do.
I think that's quite plausible. I think Netanyahu's first response will be, we cannot let Hamas rebuild in Gaza. I can't and you can't. And I'm not going to. And you and Hegseth and Waltz and Rubio have all previously promised your support. So do I have that support? We're not going to let Hamas become what it was in Gaza. B, if I were Bibi, I'd say, I want a peace treaty with Lebanon. You and your friends, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the French, you can make that happen. It is time. All of this stupid rhetoric from Lebanon and the mismanagement and the corruption has to end now in a peace agreement with Israel. Let them be part of the Abraham Accords. Force them to be part of the Abraham Accords. On the Saudi part, I think that Netanyahu is likely to say to the president, well, what I hear from them is they want a defense treaty with you. Are you going to give it to them? And there we get to 67 votes in the United States Senate, which I don't think are there. So I think as the Saudis think about this, we have to ask, what do the Saudis want? They don't care about a Palestinian state much. I mean, there is public opinion about it in Saudi Arabia. That's true. But above all, they want defense. And I'm not sure if Trump will be able to give them what they want. So I just think all the pieces of this, it's a big jigsaw puzzle. I'm not sure we're going to be able to fit all these pieces together. One other that you mentioned, Iran was the dominant country in Syria and Lebanon. That's changed. It is still, I would argue, the dominant country in Iraq, and we need that to change. Yemen, and we need that to change. There's a lot on the table here. Is it conceivable that over 4 years much of this is resolved? It is, but I would remind you what a day or two ago, President Herzog of Israel, former leader of the Labor Party, said, which is, I used to be for the two-state solution, but now, I don't know. That's a really hard sell in Israel. My question about that is, and maybe you have a thought, if you do the Venn diagram of the least the Saudis can today take and the most the Israelis can today offer on a path to a Palestinian state, do those circles overlap?
I can't say that they do. But I'm going to make another comment here. Gaza. I truly believe Donald Trump wants Gaza not to be an ongoing conflict war that bleeds support, that creates controversy over what the U.S. is or is not doing. Yes, he will support Israel thoroughly. Frankly, the Biden administration supported them thoroughly. But look at the scenes, and they were deliberate, when the first 3 hostages were released. You saw heavily armed, uniformed Hamas forces everywhere. Now, the reality of Gaza, and I'll make this as a statement, because it is backed by the views of the entire Israeli national security establishment, public, not just private, is that Hamas isn't an army that can do what it did on October 7th again. That goal's been achieved. But they have many thousands of equipped, coherently organized fighters. And the moment the IDF isn't in a particular place, Hamas is. And you saw a demonstration of that a few days ago when those hostages were released. Now, what do you do about that? Well, if you listen to the Israeli national security elite, that part of it that's still in office, hasn't been sacked or is resigning, you got to have a political horizon. You need kinetic pressure. You need continued military pressure. But you got to have a political horizon to counter the vision of Hamas. And, same breath, you need to bring in stabilizing forces. You need to bring in forces to administer, let's not call it govern, but administer en route to reconstruction. And the key to the various doors, many of which are in the Gulf, to doing all of that, is that commitment. Does MBS truly want to see a Palestinian state? He wants to see a Saudi Arabia that is prosperous, secure, and strong. That's what he wants. So do the Emirates. And the Emirates would add, and we don't want to see Muslim Brotherhood ideology advanced anywhere in the Middle East, including Syria, which is an object of great concern. But he needs, and it's not just performative, he needs to be able to say, but the framework for all those things I'm going to do, I'm going to pay for, has got to be that commitment to the different political horizon ahead. And the issue is, if that's what Donald Trump embraces en route to the grand deal, what does Bibi do? How does he respond?
If he responds by saying, okay, fine, he'll be out of office reasonably soon. I mean, the one thing you can't ask a Democratic ally to do, I think, is to commit political suicide. And that's probably going to be Bibi's answer. I agree with your analysis, but how are we going to create that Palestinian entity in a way that it is not run by any Muslim Brotherhood group, it is not run by any terrorist group, it is not a threat to Jordan or to Israel. Admittedly, this would be easier if there were no Islamic Republic of Iran trying to subvert Jordan, trying to destroy the state of Israel. That would be one step, but that's a pretty hard step to take. The kernel of a future Palestinian government is the Palestinian Authority. That's not a kernel that looks like it will turn into a very good
certainly the
corn.
United Arab Emirates, Mohammed bin Zayed, would agree with you. It must be a very different PA to have a chance.
Well, here's where I would be critical of the Biden administration. If you go back to the George W. Bush years, which you remember well, at a certain point, the United States simply forced Salam Fayyad on the Palestinians as finance minister to clean up the corruption, and then as prime minister. We have heard a lot about the RPA from the Biden administration, meaning the Reformed Palestinian Authority. They did nothing about it. When Abbas appointed Mohammed Mustafa as prime minister, a man as corrupt as his predecessor, the Biden administration let it happen. What none of us have done, not the Emiratis or Saudis, not the Americans, certainly in the last 4 years under Trump either, is to insist that change begin. So one of the things the Israelis could do would be to play it this way. Here are the preconditions for Palestinian autonomy, statehood. I don't know if they'll ever use the word statehood, but for a Palestinian entity that is self-governing. And do it with the sense that we can say this because it will never happen. To use an inappropriate metaphor, when pigs fly. Because I think it seems very distant. If one asks the question on the security side, if you don't want the IDF policing the West Bank, who's going to do it? That's a very hard question to answer.
And I would build any argumentation on that hard question and hard answer. And in Gaza, I would be even harder. Israel does not want to occupy 2.3 million desperate, starving people living amidst disaster. Doesn't want it, shouldn't want it. But if it doesn't want to wind up in that place despite itself, it's going to have to work a different resolution. That resolution is hard, and I agree with you. There has been far from the necessary pressures brought to bear by Saudi Arabia, by the Emirates, by the United States. We didn't want to put our hand on the scale with respect to Palestinian leadership. The Emirates, who looked first to us to do the dirty work, then the Saudis to bring the axe down, didn't find a willing party there. And the Saudis just didn't want to engage. So, yeah, there is a collective responsibility here. But it's first and foremost on this geriatric kleptocracy that is the top leadership of the PA. A lesson learned too well from Arafat. You eliminate upcoming generations of leaders to preserve your own power. And with all the tragic consequences for the Palestinian people that has created and the opportunity for Hamas and similar groups. So, Elliott, we face, as we started this, with challenges, but also significant opportunities. And for the administration to pursue those opportunities globally with respect to both Russia, Ukraine, and China, because I agree with you, you can't delink what you do in one place and try to do in another, as well as the Middle East. With regard to Iran, with regard to what I still believe is a strategic, valuable goal for the U.S., that Saudi deal, which has domestic U.S. political implications as well as global strategic implications, and a way to keep Gaza and Lebanon from erupting again into violence and being a source of threat and challenge. Those are challenges, yeah, but they're opportunities as well.
They really are. One can envision, not as a crazy possibility, some kind of resolution of the war in Ukraine where people are not dying and where it is clear that Putin has not really gotten anything valuable out of it. You can see a Middle East situation that, let's call it the expanded Abraham Accords with the Saudis and Lebanon. You can imagine either the elimination of the Iranian nuclear program by force, or a deal, the kind of deal that Trump wanted and I assume wants, that largely eliminates their program through negotiation, through diplomacy and pressure. He's going to want some kind of deal with China as well. I mean, one can easily imagine that his dream will be fulfilled, that the world will actually be a more peaceful place 4 years from now than it is today. And one can, sadly, easily imagine the opposite too.
We'll see, and we'll continue this discussion. Elliott, thank you for being back at the Institute. As always, interesting talks, interesting times. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zamel with support from Liza Jacobs. AV Productions was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thanks for listening.